University. Our session today is entitled Nation-State Corporate Espionage, where we'll be discussing the threats posed by Russia, China, and some other adversaries to your organizations in the commercial sector primarily, as well as exploring the changing cyber war landscape and exploring ideas around PSYOPs and memetics and some of those themes. So gentlemen, to start with, we have a very diverse audience here in the room. So can you share your thoughts on what are the most vulnerable critical infrastructures and why you feel that that's the case?
Sure.
Yeah. I would start with healthcare. With healthcare, you are seeing a variety of commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software packages running very, very sensitive instruments that have to be networked in order to allow data to leave them and visit physicians or caregivers. A lot of this stuff, it can't be patched, it can't be changed, it may not even be able to run antivirus or an endpoint program, simply because doing so would require recertification under the FDA or other legal statutes. And this stuff is exposed, and although we do our best to try to prevent HIPAA networks from actually having egress or ingress from the larger internet, they almost always do for very legitimate reasons of care. So the risk here is that you've got stuff that's critical for treatment delivery that is essentially, can be a Windows XP SP1 box that can't run AV. We started to see how bad this was with the recent WannaCry attacks, and let's just talk a little about the statistics that are available from the United Kingdom that came out last week. According to the UK's National Audit Office, 34% of the trusts or healthcare providers in the UK were disrupted by this, and this means the cancellation of almost 20,000 medical appointments, the cancellation of 600 surgeries, and the diversion of ambulances from 5 hospitals to other locations simply because treatment wasn't available. So I don't know if you'd...
So I agree. So he covered a lot there. So I'll take a different approach with it. I think the health sector in particular, and I think it's because of the Frankenstein IoT microcosms that they have in that space. So you have your legacy systems, newer technology continues to hyper-evolve, and you look at the valuable treasure troves of data like electronic health records and other PII. Now with the cyborgification, with embedded chips and insulin pumps and things like that, what we're seeing is the health sector is ready to take that quantum leap forward again without having their cybersecurity intact. So you're having, they want to start putting the electronic health records on patients with a microchip, which can work and it makes sense, but security by design has to be something that they take into consideration. We have, on the dark web, we have seen the value of electronic health records that have been exfiltrated go down because it's so readily available. We saw the same thing for those of you in the financial sector. We saw the same thing with credit card numbers, legitimate credit card number theft and things like that. There was such volume on the dark web that they eventually lost a lot of their value. So electronic health records were experiencing the same things. But the criminal element on the dark web will continue to hyper-evolve. And so they'll find new uses for the electronic health record data. So it's not necessarily, health sector theft or ID theft. They're coming up with, tax, with minors and children, they're coming up with ways to apply them to fraudulent tax returns. And so it's a whole new level of fraud. So they'll still have value, but the health sector definitely is one of the most vulnerable.
Excellent. Switching gears now, everyone in the nation and probably many other parts of the world is aware of the, U.S.'s concern with Russian influence and everything from our commercial sector to our democratic institutions. What does industry need to know about the threats from Russian APTs and what's really happening?
Yeah, I can take. I think we have two pretty pronounced and enunciated issues with Russia. The first is that there are only true technological peer adversary. China is, in reality, just pretty far behind. So the stealth and sophistication that they will exploit on American critical infrastructure networks is very creative. We talked about hammer toss at another event. Hammer toss uses steganography. It reaches out to a hashtag on Twitter, looks for instructions behind an image, and then it knows what to do and what to exfiltrate and how to do it on the network. And it's this type of stealth and sophistication that we're seeing from Russia, where technology that evolved, capabilities that evolved, are left in the network to be discovered as a demonstration of skill. The other very pronounced issue that we're going to have is I was talking to General Alexander yesterday, and he gave me the term for it, but what it is it's their influence operations is extremely potent. And a lot of people don't take into consideration the lengths that they'll go to mimetically embed concepts, like constructing mimetic skyscrapers in your minds with influence operations and psychological operations in a digital space. I think that in 2020, with the elections, the technical vulnerabilities are very pronounced. With getting to the central tabulator, a lot of people understand in order to technologically exploit the outcome of an election, you don't focus on the entire country. You focus on swing regions of swing states, starting with adding a payload to the update server at the manufacturer level with some type of decimalization program, which any of you guys that work at federal or accounting firms, this is a feature where you can manipulate the outcome of an election pretty simple. And it'll be a geo-targeted type malware that will self-delete when it's outside of the swing region of the swing state that it's meant for. And then upon tabulation at the central tabulator at the state level, after tabulation, it will then delete as well. But the influence operations, I think, will be the biggest tug of war with the psychological core of the American public, unlike anything that we've ever seen.
I think one of the things I think that will support I think you're spot on. We have to remember it in the last election, and I'm getting this from Max Boot's reporting in Foreign Policy, but the election was essentially divided by 100,000 votes cast in 3 states. So that was the decision point. That is within the scope of current actors to manipulate. You're talking about a handful of counties, and the problems with voting machines go back forever. I mean, I'm sure you've read Avi Rubin's papers going back into the early 2000s when he's looking at this Diebold stuff where, these systems are not difficult to manipulate. And as you've seen, manufacturers have a hard time keeping sophisticated actors out of their network. So there really is a supply chain risk here.
Yeah, and I think another issue with the Russian actor is the trickle-down effect to bottom feeder adversaries that we have. So what will happen is with influence operations in a digital setting, what they'll do is they'll find initiatives that separate the American public from an ideological variation perspective. We're becoming less and less of a world divided by geographic lines that were set for us 50 years ago by people who have won and lost wars. Rather, nowadays, we're a digital tribal chieftain society that's ruled by ideological variation. So what they will do is they'll take, we saw it with the Take a Knee campaign in the NFL, Antifa, the alt-right. What they'll do is hijack an initiative that has the introductory phase of it. It's early enough where they can fan the flame of this conspiracy or concept to divide the American public, where from an influence op, psychological operations, that is the op. Chaos is the op. And so success is inflicting chaos. So it's interesting if you watch the news and you see these initiatives that just come out of nowhere, or hashtags on Twitter that go viral. These are bots, and they're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and it's injected into bot technology. So this is something that you can see across the board with all of the dragnet surveillance capitalists who have become dragnet surveillance propagandists, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. These platforms are weaponized by the Russian state, and they're masters at doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that the Russian goal is basically to be a superpower again, to regain exclusive control over their old sphere of influence, there near abroad, and to remove sanctions imposed upon them by, like, the Magnitsky Act, by their invasion of Crimea. And I'm going to quote Mark Galeotti here, a historian and an analyst who says, the hybridity of Russian operations reflects the hybridity of the Russian state. You know, through the 1990s into Putinism, Russia either failed to institutionalize or actively deinstitutionalized, however you choose to define it. So what you're left with is a very oligarchic, patrimonial society, that props up one regime. What they would like to do is replicate that here.
Yeah, and the other thing with the Russian actor is they're very versatile with the asymmetric value of cyber war and psychological warfare. So in the Senate in particular, what we are covering a lot is the weaponization, the multiple variation weaponization of vectors, like the social media ones that I just talked about, not just to deliver an exploit with a malicious payload that exploits a vulnerability in a network, but also the human psychological vulnerability with psychological warfare using the same vectors. That's very important to understand. And it's interesting, one thing that Russia understands, and it's critical to understand this in order to understand this particular adversary. While the American mainstream media or our government and the intelligence community with the Senate, they will have a hyper focus on the narrative. But the embryonic state of the narrative is the meme. The Russians have mastered memetics and the meme. So if you control the meme, you control the idea of a population. If you control the idea, you control their belief systems. If you control their belief systems, you control the narrative. If you control the narrative, you control the population without a bullet. That's very important to understand when you're considering the Russian actor.
And their ability to conduct these influence operations across these social media campaigns means they have essentially a profound degree of control over the internal national discussion of the body politic.
Yeah, and one other thing that's important to understand, where in the US we may have a focus on taking metadata that's exfiltrated from a Comcast network or some other dragnet surveillance type capitalist, Facebook, Equifax, whatever. What they will do, what we'll do is focus on taking that, making a psychographic or demographic algorithm to psychographically target population subgroups to spread democracy, to do the right thing. The Russians will first start with spiral dynamics. And they'll see the evolutionary stage of a particular society, even down to a city. Then from there, once they understand the needs and aspirations of that particular society in a city, in a country, the next thing that they do is psychographic targeting. And then mimetically embedding. It's funny, I have a friend at DARPA, and what they're finding is in order to bypass the critical faculty and communicate more directly with the subconscious, and again, you have to do this over time, they're using cephal frequencies and binaural beats that are at a different frequency on YouTube. The Vimeo, I think, was another one. And this is part of a layered campaign in order to mimetically embed concepts into the subconscious mind so it becomes part of your reactionary process.
Right, it's not just the content itself. I mean, they're essentially using the lessons provided by neurolinguistic programming and hypnotism to maintain these ideas, maintain persistence of these ideas in your blessed noggin.
Yeah.
So this is actually a great segue because James, you hit on something which alludes to Russia's more kind of methodical, strategic approach. So we're going to shift gears now to China, which is another major threat to the U.S., but has a bit of a different approach with regards to how they exploit vulnerabilities in the U.S. Can you guys speak a bit about Chinese APTs and what motivates them?
Yeah.
So China's an interesting adversary because out of sheer volume, they find success in their cyber war campaigns. They are not technically sophisticated the way other actors are, and even some of the mercenary elements that we see. But they're completely held hostage to their 13th five-year plan. They enlist the help of their Chinese student scholar associations at the universities for IP theft. They're able to achieve persistence within a network, not necessarily because of stealth or sophistication or techno-savvy. Rather, the network will typically not have their the IoT microcosm layered properly with cybersecurity. And that's how they're able to find success. What we find is that if, obviously you can never stop a breach from being initiated on your network, you can only exhaust the adversary. So you exhaust them enough so that they move on to a more vulnerable candidate. And we see this with the sheer volume of attack, CyberConnect attack. They're also a victim of this domestically over there. So you have corporate espionage, which is extremely heavy over there.
That's an excellent point. I'll only.
No, go ahead.
But if you read the history, and I'm a Chinese history major, but if you read the history of China's relationship with warfare, and this is not just Sun Tzu, but basically, espionage is the way you achieve your goal. It doesn't have the bad cultural baggage or moral baggage that it does in the West. It's considered, a completely valid tool. And although we wring our hands here about Chinese cyber espionage, if you read Chinese newspapers, you'll see a tremendous amount of accusations, counter-accusations, break-ins and thefts of Chinese companies attacking other Chinese companies. This is a norm for them in a way it isn't here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just want to, so for those of you who haven't bothered to read through the new 13th five-year plan that was released in February, these are the takeaways. These are like key areas that the Chinese are going to try to develop. If you are doing this stuff, you are more at risk of serious network intrusion, intellectual property theft, and targeting. So they're looking for new energy vehicles, automotive and renewable energy, advanced computers and servers, autonomous robots, robot core components, advanced medical devices, partially autonomous vehicles, biopharmaceutical materials. This is going to be very important for them. Mobile phone chips and wide-bodied aircraft. So renewable energy, automotive, IT, biopharm, and aerospace. You're on notice, expect them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk now about we covered some sectors and specifics, but Being in New York City, there's a large number of the financial sector represented here today. So can we talk about what the cyber mercenary element looks like in the financial sector space?
Oh, you go first.
Yeah, I think in the financial sector, what you'll find is the Russian and Eastern European mercenary and cyber criminal elements are at play. FSB is an interesting domain because they still outsource to mercenaries in St. Petersburg and Moscow. PLA is also heavy with the mercenary element in China. When you hear that there's a breach or something that was initiated from North Korea, typically those are PLA moonlighting as mercenaries to the North Korean nation state. We have tech sophistication coming out of Russia in particular with groups like Carbonac or Eastern European in nature. What was the one they just now? Like within the past month, there was another one.
Oh,
it begins with S. So there's another variant of Carbonac. So they're using the same code, which insinuates this new group. I wish I could remember the name. They're Carbonac-ish, but one of the code writers took some of the code, and so we're seeing some redundancies forensically with this new actor. They have an interest in the cyber criminal aspect of the financial sector, getting in between trading signals, like a digital squawk box type thing, knowing when to buy, getting insider information from law firm networks for IPOs, mergers, acquisitions, things of that nature. China is more interested in the IP pilfering at the university level and research labs, DoD contractors and researchers, Northrop Grumman, that sort of thing. But the Eastern Bloc and Russian actors, they will bring nation-state sophistication to the cybercriminal element.
Yeah. Two things to keep in mind. You know, the Russian economy is projected to only grow at 1.7% this year. The previous year it contracted, and running against that 1.7% growth is 5.5% inflation. So you're still seeing a profound, economic stricture, being experienced by your average Russian. So this, you are going to see short-term espionage and even human espionage. Like there was the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, has an economic espionage division, and they placed an official at a Russian bank in New York City, and he was doing exactly what James was describing, just not on the network. He was finding out where agreements were being struck. He was talking about active measures campaigns to either make those agreements succeed or fail, and he was building a giant Rolodex or contact list of people that he could drag into operations later on.
I think one other thing, again, going back to CCIOS and what we do with influence operations, and I'm seeing the mercenary element rise up in a big way because they understand the vectors. They understand how to weaponize digital vectors for influence operations. So the mercenary element will become election consultants very soon. Also for, with the same type of thing with crisis management firms, PR firms, things like that. So you're seeing a lot of mercenaries become, I guess, white-collar corporate propagandists, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, mercenaries become illegal arms dealers who eventually become corporate arms dealers. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this goes back to the Second World War. This isn't a new trend. Yeah.
James, that's a great segue. You've mentioned the Center for Cyber Influence Operations, which is a new center launched by the Institute within the last few months. I want to talk a bit about the audience, what it is, and I think more importantly, why the time is right for the Institute to focus on this area.
So yeah, in the intelligence community and the Senate in particular, we go in and advise on, a lot of times they just turn their laptop around and say, what is this? Whatever. So we're looking at it, we're like, wow, okay, so the grammar and syntax is not a natural English speaker, We're able to look at different bot technologies and figure out eventually what it is, most cases. So CCIOS is for the intelligence community and certain offices on the Hill. What we'll do is go in and provide advisory on the digital application to psychological warfare, information warfare, political warfare, propaganda, understanding these things and expediting the path from where they are, wherever their office is, or whatever political silo within which agency they're at, and helping them understand how to recognize it in order to combat it. So in the federal agency space, it'll be more about combating the influence operations from foreign actors. But when I'm prepping in the Senate in particular, a little bit in the House, is to prep them for the insider threat epidemic that's rapidly coming in. Not necessarily the technical insider threat. I mean the domestic special interest group that's using nation state propaganda concepts in order to get their candidate elected or to destroy the reputation or capability of another candidate who's not on a particular platform. So it's the psychological and information warfare space in a digital setting. That's what we study.
Yeah. Why this matters to those of us who aren't regularly meeting with the Senate is this can be done to us as organizations. This will eventually be no longer at a nation state level. It'll trickle down and boutique shops will do this. You know, American financial engineering and financial growth is a profound benefit to this country. It draws a tremendous amount of overseas capital. If you can use these kinds of campaigns to discredit this, to discredit American capitalism, to somehow challenge its ethics, to challenge its morality, to prove it's biased, in the same way, you know, maybe by hacking the emails of corporate directors and releasing them the same way that we've seen done in elections, you know, you can possibly drive capital to a different shore. And that's a concern.
Yeah. So, gents, we have 2 minutes left here. So we've talked about the term hyper-evolution or hyper-evolving has been used a few times. So as technology continues to hyper-evolve, what does the future of cyber war space look like, and ultimately where is this leading us as a nation? As some final thoughts.
Yeah. Currently, you hear the term cyber war, kinetic war, but really what we're engaged in right now, in multiple variations, is a cyberkinetic meta war. The weaponization of metadata, not that's scrubbed and sold, but metadata where there's a remote access Trojan on a network at a major dragnet surveillance capitalist organization, and they're exfiltrating that data, and they're targeting, you know, you could target critical infrastructure executives with elevated privileges, with spear phishing campaigns in the grid operators, or the health sector, or DoD, whatever. You could, you know, I mean, I would look at prototypical payloads moving forward with webcam, hot mic activator, keylogger, multiple backdoors, and then the interesting field of steganography, I don't think is going anywhere. I think they're going to weaponize it on different vectors, not just Twitter, not just hashtags, but they're going to get more sophisticated. Any technology that we come out with that is meaningful can also be weaponized. So even our offensive cyber programs, we have to be very careful because we don't want that technology to get into the wrong hands. I think the future war space, the way that we're heading, will be a combination of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and autonomous technology, which is a scary place to be if you're not ready. That why we had Ron Ross here earlier. He's a good friend. He came out with, at NIST, he came out with SP 800-160. We did an accompanying SP 800-160 for the rest of us,
Yep.
which is like the Cliff Notes version if you don't want to read the 300-page doc. Ron and I went on the Hill together. We got a really good reception. So security by design is going to be a mandatory prerequisite to securing technology so that it can't be weaponized against us.
Yeah, I think that one of the metaphors that I'd pick is the First World War. So we're seeing, you know, in the First World War you had Napoleonic and Civil War era, you know, infantry and cavalry tactics deployed against machine guns and tanks. You know, we could really see that with the cyber component of a kinetic warfare, because you know, a lot of our doctrine for this stuff is 5 and 10 years old. It's based on network attack paradigms that are 10 years old, and it's going to wind up being leveraged using existing technology, which is, you know, far more widespread, far more powerful, far more emergent than we've actually thought about. I have bad feelings about this, what this will do to sort of public infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, you know, for us as people. Because we're going to be, I don't think we really know what the capabilities are because we haven't tested this stuff. We haven't been through this, you know, in a large scale. When we first do it on a large scale, it's going to be rough going.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. I told you this would be a good one. And so it makes me sleep better at night knowing there's smart folks like you guys thinking about these issues and addressing them. So please help me in thanking our panelists.
Always a pleasure, sir.